We're pleased to welcome you to the AUSA Noon Report, our virtual series featuring senior Army leaders, providing important updates on key defense topics. Our host today is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of the United States Army, General Carter Ham.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Noon Report. We're really glad that you've joined us today and appreciate your continued support for AUSA's events and programs, and especially appreciate your continued support for and interest in America's Army. As I looked at the registered participants for today's events, it was a who's who in the military intelligence community, past and present. I guess not very surprising, given our distinguished guest today. And a special welcome to so many international participants today, particularly those from our allies and partner nations. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Leidos, for their support of this edition of AUSA's Noon Report. Leidos has been an AUSA national partner since 1978 and offers innovative solutions through information technology. Thanks, Leidos. We can't do these events without you. Thank you very much. Our guest today is Lieutenant General Laura Potter, who has served as the Deputy Chief of Staff, G-2, since September of last year. Her previous assignment was as Commanding General of the United States Army Intelligence Center of Excellence in Fort Huachuca. You can access General Potter's full bio by selecting the Handout tab on the upper right portion of your screen. But frankly, it's not an overstatement to say simply that General Potter has been there and done that. Holding and leading in key intelligence positions at every level and in multiple theaters. If you have questions for General Potter today, please use the Q&A tab and post your questions in the box on the lower right-hand side of your screen. And we'll try our best to get to as many of your questions as time allows. We'll get our conversation started with a bit of a fireside chat between me and General Potter, and then we'll address your questions. So please start thinking ahead about what you want to ask the Army G2. So with that, welcome, General Potter. We're really honored that you've joined us today.
Thank you very much, sir. And first and foremost, I want to thank you and your entire team here at AUSA, and frankly, your chapters all over the globe for everything that you do for our soldiers, civilians, and their family members. You really incredibly enrich our Army, and I'm greatly appreciative for that. And I'm thrilled to be here for the Noon Report.
Well, thanks very much for that. It is our job at AUSA to support the Army and support soldiers. And thanks very much for those very, very kind words. So let's dive right into it, shall we?
We shall.
You know, Army's been pretty busy, if you haven't noticed. And so, General Potter, if you could talk a bit about how do you see the strategic operating environment today? How is that changing? And how is that strategic environment driving Army operations?
Sure, that's a great question. So when I look at the strategic environment, I would say in the 31 years I've been in the Army, the strategic environment has never been more complex or, quite frankly, as an intelligence professional, harder to assess. So you may be able to see a slide posted up into the forum that shows you some of the challenges that we're most concerned about in the Army. So if you look at the upper right, when we talk about persistent challenges and threats from a state actor perspective, we look at China and Russia as global actors with global aspirations. You know, when I was in Afghanistan in 2013 to 2014, Russia was 4 to 5 years into a very significant modernization program. Xi Jinping was beginning his modernization program in earnest. And that very same year, Russia invaded Ukraine and illegally annexed Crimea and posed a significant threat to our allies and partners. And from the point of Xi Jinping's modernization program to what we see today, we see an increased militarization in the South China Sea, and really a modernization program that has milestones in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, culminating in what they'd like to see as a world power military. If we look at Iran and North Korea, we consider those regional hegemons. North Korea continues to pursue its nuclear arsenal and its advances in ballistic missiles. And on the Iranian side, continued arming of Shia militia groups, posing a threat to our operations in the CENTCOM AOR, and certainly a threat to many of our allies and partners. And then on the VEO side, I would simply say, even though we've had some successes as a nation against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates across the globe, this is part of a long, enduring challenge that our nation is going to have to face, and our allies and partners are going to have to face. Even though they have made advances, as have we, in developing our counterterrorism capability, those are threats that aren't going to go away. But I'd like to draw your attention really to the other photos that you see on the map, on the slide rather. So if you look at, for example, climate change and natural disasters, we consider that a national security problem. So if you take, for example, the Arctic and you look at the impact of the changes to the permafrost or an increasingly navigable Arctic waterway, or if you look at the archipelagos and the threats of rising water levels, those become potentially national security challenges for those countries, and they certainly impact how the Army would have to operate in those AORs. Obviously, we've learned a lot being in the midst of a global health pandemic with COVID, and how we assess global health pandemics going forward and the impact those have on other nations and our own is very important. On the fragility front, I think as we look at fragile states, all the factors that you see on that slide before you sort of combine to put pressure on what are already fragile countries across the globe. So when you think of that social contract that has been broken between a country and its citizens, I think what we're going to see in the out years are countries that we assume are stable sort of trend towards that fragility dynamic if we're not careful. On the transnational crime front, that is not only the crimes that you probably come to mind when you see that phrase, but it's also the nexus between some of the state actors on that slide and transnational criminal organizations. And then, of course, we've got to be mindful of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction by state actors or potentially non-state actors. I do want to spend a minute focusing on information warfare. Every one of the actors that you see on this slide is contesting us in the information space. And our efforts to move forward on information advantage and being able to counter whether those are malign cyber effects, whether they are illicit activity, think cryptocurrency type behaviors, or whether that is an extremely concerning narrative of misinformation or disinformation. The whole information warfare dynamic is an area that we have to spend a lot of energy on, and quite frankly, from an intel perspective, can be very, very hard to assess. So if you look at all those challenges in the strategic environment, it really drives you to the comment in the center, which is how are we organized as an Army intelligence community to be able to support the Army in competition, crisis, and conflict. And I recall that General Flynn, the G-3 of the Army, was here late last year for a noon report, and he talked at great length about the 4 C's. So really, as an intel community, it's our responsibility to make sure that we can deliver intel at echelon to support everything going on in the competition phase and certainly be ready for crisis and conflict.
Well, that certainly is as you say on the chart, a dynamic strategic operating environment with lots of challenges. And I suspect our audience will have many questions about that. So again, go to the Q&A tab on the bottom right-hand side of your chart, and you can pose your questions for General Potter. But I want to pull a little bit on the C's that were there. You know, and a long time ago when I was in uniform, we talked about phases from phase 0 to phase 4 of operations. Now we talk more about competition, crisis, and conflict. So how does the intelligence enterprise adapt to that change, not only in the operating environment, but you're also seeking to transform the enterprise itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So not long after I took over, I think as a lot of people do when they get to a new job, we took a concerted effort to look at how are we organized and what are our primary missions and vision of the intel and security enterprise. So we narrowed down a G2 mission statement, which is really centered on how we within the Pentagon man, train, equip, resource the intel force. But I think more importantly is our intel and security in enterprise mission statement, which brings both intel and security together to make sure that we can connect, deliver, and protect a globally integrated intelligence enterprise. And that protect part is very important when you think of our adversaries' approach towards competing with us. So I think we have a mission statement that orients the entire Intel enterprise to be able to get after just what you said, and that is, how is that Intel and security enterprise postured to support us now in competition, and then across all those phases as we potentially move into conflict or crisis. I would like to focus a little bit on the priorities and lines of effort that you see at the bottom. So if you look at the people priority, and this is nested with General McConville's #1 priority, first of all, we're very focused on building cohesive MI teams. So Army senior leadership has the This Is My Squad campaign that we are part and parcel of, and we often deploy as teams within the MI Corps. So building cohesive MI teams across all of our disciplines that are competent in their particular specialty. And then the second part of the people strategy is looking at, what does the analyst of 2035 really need to be able to do? So if you think of the volumes of data that we have to analyze, the speed with which we will have to analyze it, and the way we have to synchronize for high-end conflict, we really need to look at, what do those analyst skills look like? Think, how are we going to have analysts that are savvy with machine learning and artificial intelligence? How are we going to have analysts that can train algorithms in the future? How do we have analysts that can really interpret vast quantities of open source and publicly available information, in addition to leveraging all of the traditional things we get from the Intel community? And then the third aspect of our people priority is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is two aspects. One, how are we growing diverse MI Corps in terms of gender and ethnicity? But then also, how are we ensuring with our talent management processes, AIM for officers and ASCM for enlisted soldiers, that we have diversity within the Corps, diversity of assignments and opportunities to expose our soldiers and officers to everything they need to be proficient in their tasks. On the readiness front, we are nested with the Army's regionally aligned readiness and modernization model. And in fact, we're in the midst of doing intelligence rearm. And so Army rearm will inform intelligence rearm, and that will help us steer the level at which we modernize the entire force and ensure that we've got units capable of supporting each one of the theaters. On the modernization front, we are in the midst of a 4-layered strategy that takes into account the space, aerial, tactical, and foundational layers to make sure that the equipment that we're putting in the field can do the sophisticated intel it needs to do against a peer adversary, which has a whole lot more complication than the types of systems we built to go after a counterterrorism target. And then the last thing is the foundation layer within that modernization is extremely important as we look at modernizing the top secret transport layer, nesting with the network cross-functional team on the secret and unclass and mission partner environment layer, and then all of our applications that we need our analysts to work on. And lastly, our universal ground station, the tactical intelligence targeting access node, that's going to replace our legacy ground stations that we currently have in the force. So those are the kind of the bins of Intel modernization. And then along with that, we have a line of effort that is Intel support to Army-wide modernization. And in that bin, you think of all the things we need to do to analyze the threat, analyze threat capabilities, and protect and secure our Army modernization efforts. And then lastly, allies and partners. We broke this out as a separate line of effort within the Army Intel and Security Enterprise, because I think we need a deliberate approach that brings together policy, technology, and people. So the policies to make sure we have the right ability to share and disclose our information amongst one another. the technology to ensure we can move beyond sharing finished intelligence and move to a point where we can share data in time horizons that will help us with any sort of effects process we might put in place. And then lastly, on the human level, we often talk about allies and partner relationships are about building up trust. And I think within the intelligence community, that is particularly true and particularly important. So that human dimension of in every one of the theaters across the globe, what are we doing to build that person-to-person relationship?
That's a pretty full rucksack.
It is.
I mean, of the complexities of collection, analysis, dissemination, sharing, cooperation in this challenging strategic environment. But let me pull a little bit in the competition phase again, which is where we hope to normally reside in terms of deterring and preventing conflict. How do you see how the intelligence enterprise has to change to be supportive of commanders in this competition phase?
That's a great question. So I think the first thing I would say is, I think we used to think of this phrase, set the theater, in terms of the actions we needed to do from an intel perspective to be ready should there be a conflict. And I think what we've moved towards is the theaters across the globe always need to be set, because the intel community is in the competition space every day. So the intel community is in the competition space every day for a couple of reasons. Number one, all of the combatant commands rely on situational awareness and understanding, and certainly the Army Service Component Commands and some of the echelons that you see on the slide. And by the way, that's not all inclusive. It's simply to give you an example of the kind of echelons that we're supporting as an intel corps. So that idea of supporting situational awareness and understanding, if you reflect back to the operational environment discussion that we had, requires our analysts to really have all the right tools, all the right analytic tools, and the right training to be able to see what is important in such a complicated environment. The second part about it is indications and warnings. So we make decisions within the Department of Defense based on indications and warnings that there might be a problem or a crisis across the globe. So how the Army contributes to understanding what's going on in the land domain, and quite frankly, in a multi-domain perspective with some of our adversaries or potential adversaries, is a really important task. So we have to be doing that on a daily basis in the competition space. The next thing I would highlight is intel operations. So we have ISR collection systems, we have a counterintelligence and human force, and everything that has to support their ability to be active in the competition space. I already talked a little bit about allies and partners, but once you have the things I mentioned already, the technologies, the policies, and the people, you really have to put in practice on a day-to-day basis what we can leverage from each other to have a holistic understanding of the environment. I'll give you a great example. If you look at messaging, misinformation, disinformation in the open source space, we as the United States Army Intelligence Corps can get an incredible benefit from the cultural linguistic expertise that a lot of our allies and partners have that we don't have, or we don't have at the capacity we need. So those are things that we shouldn't just aspire to and train for, but those are things that we're putting into practice to be able to do in the here and now. And then lastly, in terms of establishing the architecture, establishing and maintaining an intelligence architecture is very hard when it comes to forces that flow in and out of theater. So if you think of what we're trying to do with the multi-domain task force, an architecture that spans from Indo-PACOM or EUCOM down through a core to an MDTF to enable any kind of effect that formation would have to deliver, and making sure those Army units can fall in on that theater architecture seamlessly requires quite a bit of effort. So this is something that in the competition space that we're in now, the Army Intel Corps is very focused on making sure that we are in that fight on a daily basis and that we're setting conditions, particularly for our ASCCs, corps, divisions and multi-domain task forces. And of course, we have SFABs that are going to have their own unique mission that are going to need the same kind of support. So it's really a multi-echelon approach, and it's a sense of urgency on our part that we really need to be in that space, doing as much as we can in the here and now.
Well, thanks for that discussion. I think it's really important for us to have that understanding. The Army, of course, doesn't operate alone. It operates in a joint and multi-service or multinational environment almost all the time. And so the evolution of the multi-domain operating concept across the joint force certainly has implications for the Army intelligence and security enterprise. What kind of changes do you foresee? And you'll see we've got some questions already from the audience about JADC2 as a part of that.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So really, when you look at the tenets of MDO, we're talking about calibrated force posture, multi-domain formations, and convergence. So if I start with calibrated force posture, where we're really focused right now is making sure that our aerial ISR layer can support the commitments it currently has around the globe. A lot of those commitments are related to the CT fight, but not all of them. And that as we modernize and we look at our next evolution of the aerial layer, that we are building a force that we're going to be able to calibrate to the needs of really all the COCOMs across the globe. That is a service requirement, but it is also a joint requirement as all the services look towards what sort of ISR layer do we need. I already talked a little bit about the MI brigade theaters, but it's very, very important that the MIB-Ts have the right equipment and analytic capability to be able to support what's going on in those theaters. And then our expeditionary MI brigades, which we have 3 of them in the active component and 4 in the reserve, 2 in the reserve, 2 in the guard, that we look at how those EMIBs are able to align in the rearm model to the force posture decisions that the Army is going to make. On the multi-domain formation side, our ISR task force and the ISR task force, which is established by the Secretary of the Army, and it is the mechanism I use to modernize the force. We are very focused on organizational transformation and material and technological innovation that are in those second 2 layers. So if I look at it from the perspective of multi-domain formations, multi-domain task force number 1 has been stood up out at Joint Base Lewis McChord, and we're learning a lot of lessons based on the exercises and activities that it has done so far. Inside that formation, it has a battalion that brings together intel, information, cyber, electronic warfare, and space capabilities. So we're heavily invested in how that formation is maturing. And then our intel electronic warfare battalions, those are multifunctional battalions. That is sort of a redesign of the old EMIB structure that will place an IEW battalion both at the corps and the division level. And when you think of moving from a BCT-centric way of waging a campaign towards division and corps and the effects process they have to do, those IEW battalions are going to have a hugely important role in the targeting process, the effects process, and kludging together a really complicated analytic set on the SIGINT side. I already talked about building analysts of the future, and then really working all of that together. All that organizational transformation has to be tested and aligned over time through our exercises and agreements. And then lastly, on convergence, I would just say we are working very closely with the Assured Precision Navigation and Timing in Space cross-functional team on their space layer and our ground station, the Tactical Intelligence Targeting Access Node. And we're continuing to mature our thinking on the terrestrial layer. We have a brigade level system, the terrestrial layer system, that for the first time in our Army brings together SIGINT, electronic warfare, and cyber in one platform. And now we're looking at how do we do that at echelons above brigade. So really, those three aspects of the tenets of MDO are really what is driving our organizational transformation and everything the ISR task force is doing to modernize Army intelligence while still being able to meet our calibrated force posture commitments. So it is a tall order, but it is also great work to have in front of us, because I think we have some really sound ways ahead for every one of those layers. And we have a realization that some of the other modernization priorities the Army is bringing into the force require a sensing capability that's deeper than we can currently sense. So I think really when you take all of those together, we're in a very good place to move forward to modernize across all those layers.
Thanks for that. And following up on one of the audience questions, could you just a few comments about the Army's role in JADC2?
Sure. So all the services are really coming together on this idea of joint all-domain command and control. And really the fundamental idea behind it, when you look at the complexity of a future battlefield, is that really any service and any services sensing capability ought to be able to be part of a command and control system that allows us to maximize the best effect. And while we've always strived for joint interoperability, I think this way ahead will really enhance the timeliness and the level of interoperability that some of our not only collection systems but processing systems have.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty easily stated goal and a pretty difficult one to obtain. I think as we move forward.
So if I can add one thing, you are right, sir. If I can add one thing, I think this is why it's so important that we've moved as an Army, and I know the other services have, towards really stressing the need for open architectures. If you think of, we have some intel capabilities in the Army right now that we've had in our system going on 40 years. And so as we make some really difficult decisions going forward, we may be bringing a new system on that we're going to have into the 2050s, 60 timeframe. If we're going to do that, we really need to be able to keep up with the pace of technological change and make sure that we can ensure those systems remain compatible with our joint partners and all of our effects processes.
So that leads me to another audience question that asks about the role of artificial intelligence and machine learning in that endeavor.
So, this is a phrase that gets used quite a bit, and it is very important as we move forward. When you think of the volume of data, we're not going to be successful without it. And I always stress to people that having machine learning or artificial intelligence in your processors, whether it's at the point of sensing or whether it's in your systems that are actually doing analysis, processing and analysis, in either case, it is not going to allow us to replace a human analyst who's got to use their intuition and has got to finally make a recommendation to that commander, but it is going to make that analyst more effective. And in fact, we're not going to be able to absorb that volume of data if we don't have that. So on the AI front, we're doing some great work with DARPA. If you think in the old days, we used to talk about doctrinal and situational templates, and they were on a piece of acetate, and then we did event templates. We're sort of building those.
You're bringing back terrible memories. That's right.
They're great memories for me.
Right.
So we're sort of building those doctrinal, situational sort of templates in the AI arena, and then we need a force that can train those algorithms. So as adversary TTPs change, they can train those algorithms to interpret it correctly. Another area that AI and machine learning is going to help us quite a bit is with the vast amount of OSINT and publicly available information. So a lot of applications, and I do think we need a strategy, and we're working towards a strategy that maximizes that at the point of the sensor and at the point of the analyst.
Yeah, you made what I think is a very important point. We talk, Joan Potter, often about human in the loop in the application of lethal force, but there's also, as you indicate, there's got to be a human in the loop in the delivery and the analysis of the intelligence that ultimately drives that application of force as well.
So you're exactly right. And when I talked about everything we're doing now in the competition space, and when you think of situational awareness and understanding, even in a high-end conflict, you're going to have those things that a commander has already decided we can deliver that effect, and we can do it very rapidly using everything that sensor to shooter brings to mind. But you're still going to have a huge volume of information that is just a matter of keeping the commander updated on where we are in the campaign and allowing that commander to get ahead of decisions that might contribute to de-escalation or ending a conflict. And so those two dynamics, the Army Intel Force has to be ready to deliver quick sensor to shooter type intelligence, but we also have to be able to deliver mature, deeply thought through intelligence that an analyst has time to deliberate on.
Let me turn back to a topic that you raised at the outset with allies and partners, and a number of questions from our audience, to include one from your old commander, Lieutenant General, now retired Ben Hodges, asking specifically about how to better infuse intelligence in the Black Sea region and in the Baltic Sea region, where you have a combination of NATO allies and non-NATO partners. But I think the larger question is intelligence sharing policies and authorities outside of the formal structures of an alliance, such as NATO, where we often, increasingly, operate side by side with like-minded nations in what some might call ad hoc organizations. But what do you see in terms of improving that intelligence sharing outside of formal alliances?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I think on the first part, I would say what we have learned a lot about how to do this well within the formal alliances. If you think of the Five Eyes relationship, if you think of NATO, if you think of some of our mature relationships in the Indo-PACOM AOR, we have learned a lot about how to do that. When we take it beyond one of those agreed to arrangements, I think there's a couple things that are important. First of all, the vast majority of intel that is going to contribute to our situational awareness and understanding will likely come from open source and publicly available information. And so how we set up a framework that we can maximize their contributions to that, I think, is very important. The second piece is moving beyond the sharing of finished intelligence to the sharing of actual data. And so we have to take on a case-by-case basis when it comes to sort of higher-end intelligence production. What is that country capable of producing? What are we capable of ingesting? And exactly how would we go about doing that? And then the last thing I would say is that's one of those that once we establish those relationships, we've got to put the architecture and the people doing that together side by side on a regular basis. And without going into too many details here, where we've done that across the globe, it has worked really well. And the Army's allies and partners strategy, and where the theater commanders feel they need to leverage those relationships, I think we can do that with great success. But it does take some work up front.
But again, back to one of your earlier points, this is an area where improvements in the Army's talent management capabilities can really help you identify those skills that are necessary, recruit, develop, train to those capabilities to improve that process.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think we don't have an MOS in particular, or a skill set within Army intelligence that is designed to particularly build an allied or partner relationship. But having been a theater G2 and a COCOM J2, when you have that right person who's going to be able to figure out the human dimension of it and the architecture aspect, and then be able to work that policy process, either up through the joint process from the COCOM to the joint staff, or up through service channels. And I think at the end of the day, our allies and partners want to contribute, and they can contribute because they have unique capabilities that in some cases we don't have. So it's really incumbent upon us to say it's in our national interest and our military interest to make sure that we can take advantage of each other's capabilities.
Yeah, certainly a challenge, and those aren't skill sets that readily show up on a MOS and grade and past assignment experience. Let me change gears on you a little bit before the cameras turned on. You'd mentioned that you'd spent some time at Army Futures Command. So can you talk a little bit about what is that relationship between the Army G2 and Army Futures Command? And related to that, a particular question from the audience, the Army's role in assessing supply chain risk, which I know
Yeah.
is a great concern to the Army and particularly to Army Futures Command.
So on the first part of the question, back in the fall of 2018, there was a decision made to stand up the ISR task force as opposed to creating an ISR cross-functional team. But really, the great news is that every one of the Army intel modernization priorities is nested to support one of those cross-functional team objectives. So we are in fact building every one of those modernization priorities to enable long-range precision fires, to enable future vertical lift or soldier lethality or any part of delivering an effect beyond where we can currently sense. And we have a great relationship with General Murray and his team and all the cross-functional teams in terms of identifying where those dependencies are and moving out on a sound modernization strategy. So that's a really great news story. And really, the ISR task force could not achieve these objectives if we didn't have the great support we do from Futures Command. On your second point, I alluded to the fact that we included security in our mission statement for the intel and security enterprise. And it's not that we ever walked away from security during the CT era, but I certainly think it didn't get the priority that I think we realize it needs right now. And that is to enable us to protect our own modernization efforts and to take a holistic look at what are the risks to our supply chain. So that is complicated work. It's ongoing. And I think when you look at kind of the global commerce and how we're operating globally in this sort of space, it is going to be a complicated task going forward, but a very important one.
It also takes you, I think, into relationships with, well outside of the Department of the Army, well outside Department of Defense, with partners in the private sector, in defense industry, but also in other agencies of government where sometimes there hasn't been necessarily as long-standing a relationship as might be needed going forward.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I talked a little bit about our adversaries in the information space. They all have cyber capabilities. They've all demonstrated those cyber capabilities. There's been a lot written in open source about SolarWinds, for example. And so we need to move out in partnership between the Army and DoD and industry and everyone else involved in both helping us build our modernization systems and really other systems that we have in sustainment to ensure that when we're called upon for a crisis or a conflict, we have a secure and sound supply chain process.
Let me turn now to an audience question about force structure and your thoughts about the divisional military intelligence battalions and their capabilities. What do you think?
So we are in the process of building up the divisional IEW battalions. So this was part of that organizational redesign. And I think as we move towards increasing reliance on a division as a unit of action, that divisional IEW battalion needs to be able to really help a division commander deliver the effects he needs to deliver, but just as importantly, support an R&S mission and help that division commander be able to weight his main effort. As we built BCT modularity, some of that capability for a division commander to dynamically and rapidly do that went away. And so building divisional IEW battalions back gives the division commander the ability to see holistically across that division's battle space, the intel environment, but just as importantly, the electronic warfare environment. And that is both seeing ourselves and being able to deliver an effect on an adversary. So that bringing together of intelligence and electronic warfare inside that battalion is very, very important. It's also going to allow us to do what we call technical control and analysis at echelon. from BCT all the way up to the theater MI brigades, where we're looking at a complicated SIGINT environment next to a cyber and electromagnetic spectrum environment that our CMA cells are doing. So kludging those two capabilities together is very, very powerful for that division G2 and division commander.
We have time for one last audience question and a topic that you addressed briefly, and that's how do you leverage open source information, and particularly in this environment in which we find ourselves today, and a vision going forward, where there's just so much information out there. How do you sift through that to say, what's factual, what's accurate? Where's the foundation of reliable information in the open source? But there's so much out there.
So as an Intel professional, this is, I think, more complicated than some people appreciate. So I think first you need a trained workforce. So right now, we're going to have our all-source analysts with an additional skill identifier that have the most sophisticated level of OSINT training. But maybe out in the future, we need to have a completely separate MOS. We'll have to continue to reassess that. Then we need to get them trained, and that's basic level training all the way up to the most sophisticated aspects of how do you really manage the data and the veracity and validity of the data and understand really what you're sifting through. And then we have to have the right tools that can ingest the data. And on the data side, as an Army or as a Department of Defense or as an Intel community, we cannot afford going forward to buy data several times. So we've got to come up with a mechanism to make sure that we're able to make prudent decisions. And then we need to put it into a process where commanders are driving what they need, just like we do with PIR, that commanders are helping drive within their AOR, their responsibility, their battle space, what is it that they need from that environment. And we have learned tremendously from the Information Warfare Task Force in Afghanistan. We've learned from other things we've done for the past several years in the CENTCOM AOR or in our special operations community to support global CT operations. And now we need to take advantage of all that learning and impart those lessons in the other AORs across the globe. And that's a major priority effort for me.
Yeah, it's certainly a daunting task. I was kind of chuckling to myself as you raised that issue. Of priority intelligence requirements and the commander's role. I remember many times as a senior commander and the intelligence officer looking at me and asking, "Okay, General, why do you want to know that? What are you going to do with that information? Because there just isn't enough resource, enough time, enough people to satisfy curiosity. It's got to be focused."
Well, and the other thing that your comment calls to mind is we also need to work the authorities. If we're going to compete in the information space, if we're going to compete in information advantage, given what our adversaries are doing, we need authorities across the globe that we can do that. So I think that's also an effort we need to take on going forward.
Well, thanks, Joan Potter. You've been very gracious with your insights and your time and offered a lot for us to think about. For the audience, thanks for some great questions. We weren't able to get to all of them, but we'll make sure that Joan Potter and her staff get all those questions and can consider those moving forward. Before we close out, it would be remiss if I didn't ask you about Women's History Month. This March is Women's History Month. And as one of the most senior women in the Army today, I think we all would appreciate your thoughts about what do you think about in Women's History Month and the role that women have played in the Army to date, with some real challenges certainly in our past, but looking forward for matters of treating everyone with dignity and respect, for inclusion of women. What do you think about as we move forward in this Women's History Month of 2021?
Thank you. That is such a great way to end this discussion. So first of all, I have been blessed throughout my career with a wonderful group of mentors, men and women, that have really helped me navigate some decisions that are uniquely women's decisions when you think of family planning, when you think of oftentimes women are on the precipice of, well, maybe it's my time to get out. And in every case, I've had really great mentors, men and women, who have guided me in the right direction. And I'm very fortunate to be able to say that. So that's the first point. The second point is the Army is an awesome place for women to serve and grow and hone their leadership skills for as long as they want to serve, whether it's an initial commitment or 31 years. And so I think, the gender aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion are a very important part of the chief's people strategy. There's a lot of work being done related to policies that affect women. And I think that's an acknowledgement that the Army takes this very seriously. So I encourage all women in the Army to stay in the career for as long as they find it rewarding. And I do a lot in the recruiting space to try and bring women into the Army. And then the last thing I would say is, I think, we need to take an approach of mentorship when it comes to dual military, which is arguably the hardest aspect of this, that affords both men and women an equal shot at the way ahead. I often tell the story of my husband who retired as a lieutenant colonel and takes care of our two boys. And I'm blessed that he did that. But had we not been mentored that way, he might have taken a different decision, and so might I have. So I love my Army, and I'm thrilled that I could serve this long.
Lieutenant General Laura Potter, Deputy Chief of Staff, G-2. General Potter, thank you so much for your comments today, for your insights, but more so for your 31 years of service and for the powerful example that you offer to all soldiers, men and women, moving forward. Thank you very much for today's conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a couple of comments about some upcoming events. Just next week, starting on the 16th of March, we'll convene virtually for AUSA's Global Force Next of operation. We'll begin on March 16th with opening remarks by the Acting Secretary of the Army, Honorable John Whitley, and the Chief of Staff, General James McConville, as we move forward. So registration is open. Focus is going to be on modernization. Many of the topics that General Potter talked about will get addressed during Global Force Next. So we look forward to seeing you then. Just go to ausa.org and register. In keeping with March being Women's History Month, on March 24th, we'll have a virtual event similar to this one called Her Story, a U.S. Army panel discussion with several notable women authors, hosted by Chief Warrant Officer 5 retired Phyllis Wilson, who is president of the Women in Military Service to America Foundation and proudly a member of AUSA's board of directors. March 24th, Her Story. And on April 8th, we'll have a conversation with Dr. James Hellis, the Army's Director of Sexual Harassment, Assaults Response, and Prevention, SHARP. Certainly a timely topic, and as General Potter mentioned, a focus for the Army in these times. We look forward on April 8th to hearing from Dr. Hellis. On April 12th, we'll be joined by the Army Surgeon General, Lieutenant General Scott Dingell, the 45th Surgeon General of the Army and the Commanding General of U.S. Army Medical Command. And mark your calendars, only 214 days until the AUSA annual meeting, October 11th through 13th at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in downtown Washington, D.C. And I can't tell you how excited we are to return to in-person events. And we look forward to seeing you next October. For more information or to register for any of those events, just go to the website, ausa.org. Once again, a shout out and a big thanks to Leidos, our sponsor for today's event. The reality is we can't do events like this without their sponsorship. So Leidos, thank you for your many years of being an AUSA partner. And finally, a thanks to all of you who are AUSA members. I don't really understand it, but I suspect there are some who have tuned in who are not AUSA members. Today is the day to remedy that. Just go to ausa.org, join up, or renew your membership. We need your membership. It's a great way to support America's Army and make sure that we can continue to provide programming like today's event. So with that, thank you for joining us today. And again, General Potter, thanks for all that you have done. And I hope everyone has a great Army Day. Thanks.